We've all seen the headlines, right? Those gut-wrenching images on TV after a tsunami or an earthquake hits. And they can feel like these huge, distant events. But what if we look closer? What if we start to understand them not just as news stories, but as fundamental processes of our planet? Processes that are actually deeply tangled up with our own human stories.
So let's start with this one big idea. This quote really gets to the heart of it. Change is the law of nature. From the planet's point of view, change isn't good or bad. It just is. A volcano erupting and an apple ripening on a tree are, in a way, the same thing. They're both just natural processes of change. It's only when we humans are in the picture that one becomes a gift and the other a complete catastrophe.
All right, so here's our game plan. First, we're going to break down the difference between a hazard and an actual disaster. Then we'll get into the surprising role we humans play in all this. After that, we'll look at the incredible forces that literally move the ground beneath our feet and the sheer power of wind and water. And finally, we'll see how we're learning to live with all this risk.
Okay, first things first. Before we dive any deeper, we need to get our terms straight. Because to really get a handle on this topic, we have to be super clear about what we mean when we say hazard versus when we say disaster. And really, the key difference is all about potential versus reality. Think of it this way. A natural hazard is the potential for something bad to happen. It's like a fault line that runs under a city. The threat is there, just waiting. A natural disaster, well, that's when the threat becomes real. The fault line slips, the earthquake hits, and the result is just devastation. It's that exact moment a hazard turns into a catastrophe.
And here's the more official definition. I want you to notice the key idea here: scale. A disaster isn't just, a bad day. It's an event so massive that it completely overwhelms the community's ability to cope. It's the point where the usual emergency services just aren't enough, and you need this massive, extraordinary response to even begin to deal with it. So we can pretty much group disasters into these four main buckets you see here: atmospheric, terrestrial, aquatic, and biological. And here's the thing, in a country as huge and diverse as India, almost every single one of these has left its devastating mark at some point. Okay, now this is where the story gets a lot more complicated. For a long time, we kind of saw ourselves as just helpless victims of nature's wrath. But what we're starting to figure out is that the line between a natural disaster and a human-made one can be incredibly blurry. We can think about our involvement in a couple of ways. First, you've got the disasters we cause directly, things like industrial accidents or massive pollution events. But maybe even more often, it's our actions that indirectly make natural hazards so much worse. Cutting down all the trees on a hillside doesn't cause the rainstorm, but it can absolutely turn heavy rain into a catastrophic landslide. Building a whole town on a floodplain doesn't create the river, but it sure does put thousands of people right in harm's way. And this right here perfectly captures a modern paradox. Our technology is incredible. It lets us build huge coastal cities, drain wetlands, and totally reshape the land. But that very same power can actually put us in more danger. Developing massive port cities like Mumbai or Chennai makes a ton of economic sense, but it also makes them incredibly vulnerable to cyclones and tsunamis.
All right, let's zoom in on some of these specific hazards now, starting with the ones that come from deep inside the Earth itself.
The entire story of earthquakes in India really begins with this one simple, powerful fact. The landmass of India isn't just sitting still. Nope. It's part of a tectonic plate that is just relentlessly, unstoppably pushing north, smashing into the massive Eurasian plate.
1 centimeter per year. That's about how fast your fingernails grow. It doesn't sound like much, does it? But I want you to imagine that slow, constant, unstoppable pressure building up for decades, for centuries. The plates get locked together, and the stress just builds and builds and builds, waiting for that one moment when it all has to snap. And here you go. This is the direct result of all that pushing. This map shows India's earthquake hazard zones. That constant pressure from the Indian plate is what creates the huge seismic risk you see all along the Himalayan region, from Kashmir all the way through the Northeast. It puts millions and millions of people in those very high and high damage risk zones.
And when all that stored up energy is finally let go, this is the consequence. Earthquakes are, without a doubt, one of the most unpredictable and destructive disasters out there. In a single instant, they can wipe out everything that took generations to build, turning homes and entire cities into rubble.
So what can you do? Since we can't stop earthquakes from happening, the focus has to shift to being prepared and reducing the damage. That means setting up monitoring centers, creating detailed vulnerability maps like the one we just saw, and, this one's crucial, changing how and where we build, making sure earthquake-resistant designs are mandatory in those high-risk areas. Now, when a massive earthquake happens under the ocean, it can trigger another terrifying event, a tsunami. That sudden jolt of the seafloor shoves a gigantic column of water upwards, creating these powerful waves that can travel across an entire ocean. The name tsunami, by the way, actually comes from Japanese, and it means harbor wave. This slide shows the terrifying paradox of a tsunami. See, way out in the deep ocean, the wave might only be a meter high. A passing ship might not even notice it. But as it speeds towards the coast and the water gets shallower, all of that energy gets squeezed together. The wave slows down, but it rears up, growing to an incredible height right before it unleashes all of its catastrophic power on the shoreline. All right, let's shift our focus now. We've talked about the solid ground under our feet, but now let's look at the powerful forces in our atmosphere and our oceans. These two maps together really paint a stark picture of India's vulnerability. I mean, look at it. With that long coastline on both sides, it's wide open to tropical cyclones that form in the Bay of Bengal and the Arabian Sea. And at the exact same time, its huge northern plains, fed by these powerful river systems, are super susceptible to massive flooding. Just try to wrap your head around this number for a second. 40 million hectares. That's the amount of land in India that the National Flood Commission considers to be prone to flooding. It's just a staggering figure, and it really drives home the sheer scale of this challenge. And then, on the complete opposite end of the water problem, you have drought. And it's not just one simple thing. A drought usually starts as meteorological, a simple lack of rain, but that can set off a chain reaction, leading to an agricultural drought, where the crops start to fail. Then that can become a hydrological drought, as rivers and reservoirs dry up. And finally, you can end up with an ecological drought, where entire natural ecosystems just start to collapse from the lack of water. So, faced with all these incredibly powerful forces, how do we respond? Our final section looks at this big global shift in thinking, moving away from just reacting after a disaster hits and towards actively building a more resilient future. You can actually see this growing awareness on this timeline. By the late 80s, the world was waking up to the fact that disasters were getting worse and that we needed to work together. This led to the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, and it all sort of culminated in 1994 with the Yokohama Strategy, a really important agreement that laid the foundation for how we approach disaster management today. And so we're going to end with a really critical question. As we build our world bigger and bigger, as we build bigger cities, reshape whole landscapes, and push into new areas, are our own choices making us more vulnerable? And our constant search for progress, are we accidentally engineering the very disastrous we're so afraid of? That's definitely something to think about.